Well, overnight, the head of NATO said that Russia is mobilizing an additional 200,000 troops, readying a massive offensive. Poland is ready to send F-16 jets to Ukraine in coordination with NATO. And Ukraine's head of intelligence says Crimea will be retaken by Ukraine. Joining us now is Colonel Douglas MacGregor. Colonel, I want to get you to talk about all of this and in this breaking news in just a second. But first, you wrote a new piece called "This Time It's Different," and I want to start there. You point out how neither we nor our allies are prepared to fight an all-out war with Russia. This is what you write. And yet on Sunday, we have the NATO Admiral Robert Bauer telling us that we are ready for a, quote, direct confrontation with Russia. Listen.
We are ready to a direct confrontation with Russia.
We are. I think what we have done after the war started was the battle groups along the eastern flank. We had 4 in the north, the 3 Baltic states and Poland, the enhanced forward presence battle groups. We have decided now, the leaders in Madrid have decided to create 4 more battle groups in Slovakia, Hungary, Romania and Bulgaria, and to basically strengthen those battle groups, make them a little bit larger, give them a little bit more support in terms of fire support, and give them better stocks for ammunition and other things. So I think that is an important message for the Russians, that our posture has changed, to show them that we are ready if they would have an idea to come to NATO. The challenge for both sides is that the industries, the defense industries in the West and in Russia, need to ramp up production. And we basically have an economy now that is just in time, just enough. We have to have this debate on prioritization. And that is, in a way, talking about a wartime economy, but in peacetime. And that's difficult, of course.
So, Colonel, in one breath, he says that we're ready to take on Russia head on, while in another breath, he says we don't have the weapons to do it. It sounds like he's speaking out of both sides of his mouth. What do you make of that?
Well, not a great deal. Let's be frank. If this is supposed to reassure your potential opponent of your readiness to defeat him, it's a pretty stupid statement. Frankly, I don't know what they're talking about, ready for a confrontation. The confrontation with Russia will not be in the mid-Atlantic. It's not going to be in the mid-Pacific. In other words, it's not going to be a naval war per se. And any of our surface vessels, and for that matter, even our submarines, could be tracked. Now, the nuclear submarines in deep water can't be easily tracked, but the surface vessels can. So the notion that somehow or another he's ready to do something strikes me as ludicrous nonsense.
So in your piece, you talk about the readiness right now. And I like how you start. You say, this time it's different, that somehow they're telling us that it's going to be different. And NATO is not prepared to do this. We're running out of ammunition. Where do you think NATO goes from here? It sounds like, and if you listen to this admiral talking, we need a wartime economy. He says that we need to turn our factories into military production machines right now because our stocks are drying up and we're going to take Russia head on. We need to convert factories in all of these NATO countries and go all out for a full-blown head-on collision with Russia.
Well, it's useful to keep in mind that in Russia, the manufacturing facilities for military equipment and weapons and ammunition are running 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Russia's already mobilized and integrated 300,000. The possibility that they will bring in more is very, very likely. I don't dispute that, because every time the Russians look to us and indicate a willingness to talk, we make it abundantly clear that the Russians have a choice. They can either completely withdraw from Ukraine or commit suicide. That's not necessarily a good starting point for negotiations. So the Russians are doing what you would expect them to do. They're getting ready for a much larger fight if necessary. This is something we're not prepared for. No one in Europe is prepared for this. We're not prepared to mobilize anybody in Western Europe. The only people who've mobilized soldiers at all to this point are the Poles. And the Poles are courageous people. There's no question about it. I think the notion of going to war with Russia at this stage is idiotic. But they also don't have the most modern equipment and capabilities that we do. So even though they can provide numbers, they're not necessarily capable of augmenting us. And we have at most 50,000 combat troops in Europe. At most, we have 100,000 soldiers in Europe, but that doesn't mean combat soldiers. That just means soldiers. In terms of those people that carry the fight to the enemy, that close with and destroy the enemy, that launch rockets, missiles, and ammunition at the enemy, no, we've only got 50,000. We're now looking at a force in and around Ukraine of 700,000 plus, with the potential to go close to 1 million, and new plans to permanently expand the Russian military establishment, especially the army. This is all crazy nonsense. We ought to stop talking about it. We need to get back to understanding the Ukrainians are losing badly. They're taking horrific casualties. They're crumbling down in southern Russia, and the Russians have yet to launch their major offensives. I mean, stop and consider that. They're not even facing the body of the force that's on its way to them at some point, and they're falling apart.
So the 200,000 then in southern Ukraine, you're talking about this 200,000 that Jens Stoltenberg said last night, that Putin is mobilizing this additional 200,000 for this new invasion to topple Ukraine, and he won't stop, warns the NATO chief. He's not going to stop. So this new mobilization...
Well, he's not going to stop until the Ukrainian forces are destroyed.
Right.
That was made very, very clear early on. That's the threat to Russia. And of course, we keep calling this an invasion. In reality, this is a counterstroke. He's responding to the threat that metastasized in eastern Ukraine, designed to destroy Russia. We're talking about defeating Russia, humiliating Russia, dismembering Russia. Good Lord, I'm surprised he hasn't simply declared war at this point and mobilized millions.
Right. Well, you have then, I want to put up this quote by Steve Bannon, because I think it's, certainly when we talk about Crimea, right? So this is what we've been hearing from the intelligence chief in Ukraine, as I mentioned at the top, that now the Ukrainian intelligence is saying that Crimea will be retaken by Ukraine. And here's what Steve Bannon said: the globalists with the Biden regime leading have taken the war from defend Ukraine to liberate Crimea after $100 billion and losing a third of the country to the Russian army. So now this is the new message: liberate Crimea, forget defend Ukraine. Is that what we're starting to see now? More this talk is that's the new mission?
You know, I'm beginning to think that there was never much coherent strategy to begin with, other than we're here to hurt Russia. I mean, that's essentially what we were told. This whole thing has become incoherent now.
Right.
The notion of striking at and liberating, as they say, liberating Crimea is a bunch of nonsense. It's all crazy. And I'm afraid what the Russians are discovering is the only way to put an end to this nonsense is for them to commit 100% to the destruction of the Ukrainian forces and ultimately to the elimination of this regime in Kyiv. Now, they're going to do that. But instead of seeing this sort of massive blitzkrieg that we're accustomed to because of the experience with the Germans in World War II, I think you're talking about 3 or 4 axes where you have effectively meat grinders on each one. Imagine bulldozers that are just moving forward, steamrolling what they find in their path until ultimately everything is gone. This is going to take a little longer, but the Russians want to be absolutely certain that they've annihilated the enemy. That's what we're going to watch. I also think the Russians are very concerned about our impulsiveness. We're in no position to interfere with what they're doing in Ukraine. And this is the reason I wrote this. Again, people need to be warned. This regime in Washington is amateurish. They're ideological and amateurish. They don't really understand what they're up against. They never did. They miscalculated when they thought, well, the Russians are weak. See, they didn't come in there gangbusters the way we would. Well, of course they didn't, because they were dealing with brother Slavs. They didn't want to kill Orthodox Christian Slavs. They were trying to find a way around it. When it became clear there was no alternative, that's when everything changed. So you're going to see the giant meat grinders show up and crush whatever is left in that country. But the more we talk about lashing out, the more we talk about, quote unquote, liberation or removing Putin or these kinds of things, the worse it's going to get. We got to get out of this business and start coming to terms with reality. But reality is not very popular in Washington.
No, but it seemed like there was a moment of clarity from Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin in Ramstein, Germany, just last week, when he said, and you pointed this out in your piece, when he said, look, there's a narrow window here for NATO. There's a very narrow window for us to, I guess what he was saying is, funnel as much weapons as we can in order to somehow help with this offensive right now before Putin launches this massive strike.
I think he's talking about trying to rescue Ukraine before it collapses. Right now, a friend of mine who is a demographer got a hold of me and said, look, Doug, at the beginning of this war, there were supposedly 37.4 million people in Ukraine. Says in reality, there were already 2 million Ukrainians working in the United Kingdom and the European Union. And once the war began, over 10 million Ukrainians left. In other words, they packed up their bags and they moved out. 1 million plus went into Russia, the rest went west. Now, if you look at those numbers and then you consider that right now, inside the areas currently controlled by the Russians, there are 4 million so-called Ukrainian citizens. Of course, they're Russians. They speak Russian. They are Russians, and they're living under Russian administration. They're all very happy to have, quote unquote, been liberated. But when you start adding up these numbers, and then you look at the casualties that no one wants to tell the truth about, you're looking at 18 to 22 million people left in Ukraine.
Wow.
Now, Clayton, that's the size of the Netherlands. The Netherlands. You cannot maintain this war with a million plus under arms and enormous quantities of equipment being poured into it with 22 million people right now, especially when they're all living on the edge of poverty. They have no energy. They're worn out. They're exhausted. And the discontent in Ukraine is absolutely out of the ballpark. People there are sick of it. And they're sick of Zelensky. His soldiers keep posting videos that they take of themselves and their comrades on the front line saying, here we are. We're starving. We're freezing. We're being abandoned. The wounded are being left alive, alone to die. And now we also have this epidemic with tuberculosis that the West refuses to recognize. These are terrible conditions. Ukraine is headed for collapse. So Austin is saying, look, give us all you can right now because this may be our last shot. Now, inside NATO, though everyone is keeping quiet, most of NATO is absolutely enraged that this continues. They want it to stop. They see no point in this, but everyone is afraid to contradict or cross the United States. And I understand that. They want good terms with us. They want good relations with us. They want to trade with us. But increasingly, privately, they're saying this is out of control. We didn't sign up for this. And the Europeans did not sign up for total war with anybody.
Right. Well, and it seems like you've got these countries that are, as my dad used to say, stuck between a hell and a handbasket. No, I can't forget all
rock and a hard place.
Rock and a hard place, hell and a handbasket. All my dad's idioms growing up. It's hard to remember. Some of them are off color, and I can't use the language here on the show.
Yeah,
but, you see like countries like Poland, countries like Portugal, who are funneling old 1970s Leopard tanks there just to, I guess, appease the West and say, here, President Biden, see, we have these old museum pieces. We want to be in your good graces. And Poland now going to send F-16s. And they just got all these new Apache helicopters that they're buying from the U.S. and going to be sending. So you're right. I think they're just going to keep funneling this there to make the United States happy. Is that the goal?
I think that's true for everybody but Poland. And I think this Polish government lives in the distant past. When you mention Russia, I think they see Bolshevik Russia in the 1920s. They see the Soviet Union, they see Stalin. They refuse to come to terms with the reality that Russia is not a Soviet state. It's not a communist state. The Russians are not interested in a war with Europe. They want desperately to do business with Europe. Moscow does not want to occupy and rule other people that are not Russians.
Right.
I mean, one of the great lessons of imperialism is that imperialism doesn't work very well. Territorial imperialism is expensive. You end up with large numbers of people who are foreign to you. They don't really want to be governed by you. The Russians learned this. And this was Alexander Solzhenitsyn's mission. His famous observation. He said, we Russians should be glad that these people are free and independent of us. We don't want to rule them. We want our own country. And no one is more devoted to Alexander Solzhenitsyn than Putin. So the notion that the Russians want to come in and deal with 40 million unhappy, miserable Poles is absurd.
Right.
It's just not true. But they're pushing this war. And I think in their minds, they believe that if they do this hard enough, that they will endear themselves to us. They haven't figured out something. We don't live in Europe. You know, we're a maritime and an aerospace power. We don't maintain major land forces overseas. That's why you've only got 50,000 combat troops, if that, in Europe right now. So they've lost their minds. And we have had a bad habit of, over the years, overextending ourselves. And when people came to us and said, well, we don't like country X, help us, we should have said many, many times, get along with your neighbors. War is not the only option.
Right.
Find a way forward. So we're in the position of the tail wagging the dog. We're the dog. Everybody's got a hold of our tail and wants to wag the deckings out of it.
Well, it seemed, and I just got from your piece, it really seems like we're at this inflection point right now, this tipping point. You know, if NATO really wants to go all in and do whatever it can to try to quote unquote save what's left of Ukraine, this is going to be a disaster. Either that or they pick it up and they go home, which doesn't seem likely.
Well, Clayton, back in January, I was interviewed in Washington by Dimitri Simes for one of his programs. And I was asked specifically about NATO. And I said, if we push this and the Russians go in and we fail to negotiate an end to this quickly, this will destroy NATO. Remember, NATO was founded as a defensive alliance. It was never designed for offensive operations.
Right.
There's nothing in the NATO charter about attacking anyone. Everything's about being the object of attack, the victim of attack. We have been trying to use NATO as an offensive weapon since the 1990s. Since stupid people like Senator Lugar in the Senate said, well, either NATO is out of area, in other words, it's going to operate beyond Europe, or it's out of business. And most of us stood around at the time in the military and said, well, maybe it needs to go out of business because there's no reason for it to exist anymore. So we've reinvigorated in our minds the Russian threat. We've provoked it. We succeeded. It's there. But it would be misleading to assume that there is an aspiration to dominate the continent. It's a losing proposition. The Russians know that. That's not what they're about. They're very disappointed in the Germans, who are their principal trading partners, and can't understand why Germany has turned so radically hostile to Russia. There's no reason for it. Poland, however, is the danger point, because Poland is the one nation that will commit itself all out to war against the Russians, as foolish and misguided as that is. No one else wants that. So I think as this moves forward and we put more and more pressure on the alliance, eventually the alliance will crumble, because this is not what Europeans want. All you have to do is look at the polls. 60+% of Europeans everywhere are saying, no, we don't want a war with Russia. You're in Portugal. The Portuguese have said, sure, send them our old stuff. Make them happy. We love the United States. We want good relations with them. I don't see any Portuguese lining up to fight in the east, in eastern Ukraine. Forget it. It's not going to happen.
No way. Unbelievable. So this could lead to the total destruction of NATO.
I'm always worried about that.
Yeah,
NATO is a sort of what was the old Henry James used to say, sacred cows are never slain, they simply vanish. Well, over time, I think NATO would simply have vanished because there was no real requirement for it. But now I think there's a good chance it will be slain and go out of business the hard way.
Right. You always need an enemy, so you try to create one, provoke one, and it's going to come back to bite you. Fascinating. I would encourage all of you guys to go out there and read the Colonel's great piece. I'll link it up in the description. A really fascinating read in the American Conservative this weekend. So thank you for that. And thanks, as always, for your great insight, Colonel. We really appreciate it.
Sure, Clayton. Good to talk with you.
And we'll be watching what happens with this mobilization over the next few weeks. I do believe it is this narrow window right now, this, as Lloyd Austin pointed out, this narrow window before this spring offensive unfolds and all hell breaks loose. But it doesn't seem like NATO has any appetite to pull back. It's like they're just, I don't know. Yeah. There's go all in, right?
Yeah, I just one thing that he said that just really kind of hit me, and I was like, huh. And it's like you never hear it, and it's the telling people, like, when they ask the U.S. for help, we only have one tool that we bring, and it's never, well, just make peace with your neighbors because we don't want to come over there and bomb people. No, we're like, hell yeah, you got problems, we got solutions. I mean, no, we don't have solutions, we have a solution. Yeah, we can bomb them,
exactly,
and we're happy
like
with that.
Team America, like what was that Team America? The Stone Brothers, whatever. The America, F yeah. Like we only know one thing.
We know one thing. And we're run out, and it's stuff that's antiquated at this point too. Run out. Thank you so much for watching this segment here at Redacted. We are live every day at 4 p.m. Eastern time, trying to share the stories that the mainstream media will not cover. You should also come over and join our community of Redacted Rebels over at redacted.inc. That's our private locals community where we can share exclusive content that we simply cannot share here on YouTube. Come over and join the rebellion together right now by going to redacted.inc. We'll see you next time.